Good evening and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas online public lecture series and the 27th Richard Jones Memorial Lecture to be delivered by Amanda Cahill from the Next Economy. First, to deliver a welcome to country this evening, I'd like to introduce Elder Uncle Dougie Mansell.
Hello, my name is Dougie Mansell and I'm from Cape Barren Island, which is off the northeast coast of Tasmania. Today we are meeting on Aboriginal land, Lutruwita, Tasmania, our sea, our waterways. I acknowledge and pay my deepest respect to my Aboriginal ancestors, the traditional owners for the land. I extend my respects to elders past and present as the knowledge sharers of Aboriginal culture. I acknowledge and pay respects to Aboriginal people that did not make elder status. They are never forgotten by family and the community. I acknowledge the continuous hard work of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community as the custodians and caretakers of Lutruwita, Tasmania. Aboriginal people have loved and cared for country for thousands of generations, handing down stories that can be told today within the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. Not the ones in books, but the ones handed down by their parents and grandparents and their parents. Aboriginal people are strong people, still here and connected to their family, community and country. So it's now with pride I welcome you all to Aboriginal land. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Dougie. That's always really important for us to be welcome to country, and I really appreciate your words and the representation that you give to the Aboriginal community in Tasmania. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Todd Houstine. I'm facilitating tonight on behalf of the Richard Jones Memorial Lecture Committee. And the Island of Ideas is a program designed to keep the ideas flowing during this period when we're unable to attend live events in public. And so we are very grateful to have the university's support in presenting this lecture as part of its inspiring community workshops and lectures. Just a few housekeeping notes before today's forum gets underway. Your microphone, camera, chat function, and raised hand function have all been disabled, so our speakers are not interrupted. But we do encourage you to ask questions, and this can be done at any time by typing them into the Q&A function, which you'll see on your screen. And selection of the questions asked through that function will be answered towards the end of today's session. And finally, this lecture is being recorded for later access on YouTube and SoundCloud channels. The lecture is in memorial of the late Dr. Richard Jones, who made an outstanding contribution to environmental awareness in Tasmania, in Australia and beyond. In the early 70s, he played a pivotal role in the Lake Pedder Action Committee and in the formation of the United Tasmania Group, which is the world's first comprehensive Greens party, both of which provided the groundwork for the later successful national campaign to prevent the damming of the Franklin River. Dr. Jones was also instrumental in establishing the community-based Tasmanian Environment Centre, now Sustainable Living Tasmania, for whom I've been fortunate enough to work for the last decade. And he also played a leading role in converting the Australian Conservation Foundation into one of the nation's most dynamic environmental organisations. Further, in establishing the Postgraduate Centre for Environmental Studies at the University of Tasmania, Dr. Jones did much to promote problem-oriented, interdisciplinary environmental research that has provided the community with valuable information and innovative ideas. College students, graduates and friends from the Centre for Environmental Studies at UTAS, in conjunction with the Tasmanian Environment Centre, established the Richard Jones Memorial Lecture Committee and Trust. And this is now the 27th Richard Jones Memorial Lecture tonight that we've been able to present. So thank you very much for attending tonight. And I'd like to now introduce our speaker, Dr. Amanda Cahill, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Next Economy, an organisation that supports regional Australian communities to develop more resilient, just and sustainable economies. You've likely already read her bio on the webpage for this event, so rather than read it to you again now, I'll tell you a little bit about my personal experience with Amanda. It was almost 15 years ago. I was working for a wonderful organisation called Engineers Without Borders, and we had the very good fortune of Amanda joining our team. She quickly earned our respect and our admiration as one of those rare people who is adept at both thinking broadly and deeply, is not only clever but also compassionate, and is not just well-intended but possesses the skills required to truly make a positive difference. And so, ladies and gentlemen, to deliver the 27th Richard Jones Memorial Lecture, I hand over to Dr. Amanda Cahill.
Thanks, Todd. It's so nice to be doing this lecture. It's a real honour. So I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to deliver this lecture in the memory of somebody so inspiring. And I'd also like to thank Uncle Dougie for the welcome. It is really important to have that as the start of this, because our First Nations people do so much for country and are often unrecognised for the continuing role that they play as stewards of the continent of Australia. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm calling in from, the Yagara and Turrbal nations here in Brisbane, and acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As Todd said, I run an organisation called the Next Economy, and I guess our mission is around a question, which is, how do we have an economy that works for both people and the planet? How do we move past this false dichotomy that's been in play for so many years, stymieing our politics around, you can choose jobs or the environment, but you can't have both? Because at this time, with the work that we need to do around climate change and around regenerating our natural systems, there is plenty of work that we need to do and plenty of investment to flow. So what the work looks like in practice is a lot of it is on the ground in regional communities all across Australia, not just Queensland. We've worked in Queensland from as far north as Cairns and Townsville, down through the central coal regions, down to the southwest, but we've also been working in the Hunter Valley and around Newcastle, and down in Victoria a few years ago when the Hazelwood Power Station was closing, and across to WA as well. So our mission is broad. It is about working across all sectors and how we can reduce and absorb emissions across those sectors. But in practice, most of the work has been in areas that are quite dependent on resource extraction, particularly around coal, or where there's a coal-fired electricity plant that is likely to close. And our goal is to try and shift the paralysis and the confusion and the division that has been really getting in the way of meaningful climate action. I'm only going to talk for probably around 25 minutes or so, because I think it's really important to practice what I preach, and that's to open up a conversation about this, because we're living in really interesting times. And I think the biggest question is, how do we bring everyone along with us? Because we're facing potentially more division and polarisation if we can't get that right. I'm going to start by reflecting on a moment that I'm never going to forget. And it was a moment of panic back in 2016 during the US presidential election, when I realised to my horror that I was agreeing with Donald Trump. He was talking about how if he were elected, he was going to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the free trade agreement that was being negotiated at the time. Only that week, I'd been attending meetings of progressive left-leaning groups that were trying to mobilise opposition in Australia to the very same free trade agreement, the TPP. And he was saying exactly what I'd heard in the meeting. They were talking about how bad a deal it was because it was undermining the sovereignty of nations. It was giving even more power to corporations at the expense of local people in determining how resources were used and how to protect workers. And opposition to the TPP was not the only time I found myself agreeing with people that I normally wouldn't identify with, either personally or professionally or politically. Time and again, as we've seen the gaps widen between the left and right extremes, particularly over the last 5 years, and as the debates have become increasingly bizarre and sometimes hysterical, I actually keep seeing the same shared logic and pattern underneath seemingly opposing views. So I've made myself listen longer and deeper to what people are saying, and I'm starting to see the same cries underneath the noise. Do I have a place in the future? What about my kids? Are we going backwards? How is it that I work so many hours or multiple jobs, but I can't always make ends meet? I just can't face the horror of what climate change really means, especially when I can't do anything about it. Why isn't the government doing more? And what's the point of them anyway? And what happened to all those services that we used to have in our small town that aren't here anymore? We actually used to be a lot more resilient than we are now, even though we're supposed to be wealthier than ever. What so many of us miss is how radical these questions really are, and how they point to widening cracks in systems that are failing to serve even the most privileged among us. And that's a system that values growth and development at all costs, that equates real jobs and economic development with extraction, that sees wealth and power ever more concentrated in the hands of a few, that undermines actively democratic processes and institutions, that distances the consumers from the places of production, and that outsources destruction and exploitation of both people and the natural sources on which we all depend. Climate change, COVID, ongoing economic and political instability we're seeing all over the world right now, they're all symptoms of a system that's starting to crack apart. The problem is, of course, that as a species, humans don't do so well when we panic. And looking at the looming tipping points that we're facing, particularly over the next 10 years, there is plenty to panic about. So what do? Do we just ignore the fact that over 73 million people voted for Donald Trump, and that there are plenty of people across Australia who would also vote for him if given a chance? Do we sigh relief that Biden has committed to trillions of dollars in climate action? I think that would be a mistake for 2 reasons. First, we have a historically unique moment, an opening right now to address the underlying cause of so many environmental problems by bringing forth a new economic narrative and systems. And this moment is not going to stay open for very long. Second, ignoring what so many people across rural and regional Australia have been saying for so long, sometimes, so not always, through the mouthpieces of colourful characters like Barnaby Joyce or Pauline Hanson or Clive Palmer, means missing the opportunity to learn, heal, and co-create a future that might be better for everyone. So how do we do that? Well, let's take each point separately. So first, how do we seize the moment that is now? Because the opportunity at the moment is to amplify and develop economic practices and systems that don't just look after people and don't just create jobs, but actually have a chance to regenerate land, water, and air ecosystems that we depend on. I think the combination of the bushfires and then COVID has really opened up a space where people are questioning the status quo. For a long time, there's been people like me, like Todd, people who are doing these lectures, pointing to these issues, but most people have been kind of comfortable and sort of saying, oh, you're being catastrophizing, it's really not that bad, while they go further and further into debt. But COVID in particular, I think, really shook people up. It really, and the bushfires on top of that, before that, showed up the fragility of systems which people were taking for granted in this country, not just the economy, but the role of government and the importance of having services locally. COVID in particular made a lie of the rhetoric of the last 20 or 30 years that government shouldn't really get involved. They really should get out of the way. They should let the market decide how things happen. They don't need to invest in that. That means debt. We shouldn't go into debt. It also showed up some of the growing inequalities and how many people are just getting by in Australia. Most people aren't aware that that 16% of households in Australia are food insecure. So when the supermarket shelves went empty really quickly, people went, wow, how does our food system actually work? How are we this vulnerable? How is it that aged care workers, these terrible people who are spreading this disease around, why are they still turning up to work if they're sick? Oh, just a minute, they're actually having to work 3 jobs to get by. How is that possible? Why is that the case? So it really started to show us who we are and what we value. On the flip side, the bushfires in particular started to, and then the COVID and the need for economic stimulus and the recovery really put to the fore some of the really good work that's been done over the years by groups like Beyond Zero Emissions and Climate Works that have continuously demonstrated the amount of work that we need to do to address climate change, not just in energy, but in how we change our land use and agricultural practices, the work we need to do around our transport systems, our construction and buildings and energy efficiency, our waste systems. Every sector, we need to do a lot of work. It not just creates jobs, but it also builds communities and long-term economic resilience. And it's been great to see some of those reports actually getting some airtime. On the back of that, I think there's been a new relationship with technology. And when you start thinking about the work that we need to do around renewable energy and the opportunity for that to be decentralised, it started different kinds of conversations around who should own our systems. If we decentralise them, can that actually back in communities? Can they make money off it themselves rather than depending on large-scale companies? But one of the most exciting things I saw, particularly out of the bushfires, was that the role of First Nations peoples and their knowledge and their practices and how important they are in maintaining country really came to the fore around burning practices. And now there's more conversations about how important it is to have people on country, not just for burning, but for all sorts of different ways of maintaining the health of our ecosystems. And finally, I think the cry around building back better started to start some really interesting conversations across communities all over Australia. So there are bushfire communities, for example, that haven't actually started building back yet. The money is there, but they're doing things differently and starting to bring people together to actually question what they want to build. So it's not so much building back better, it's building back differently. What do we want to invest this money in to actually make a stronger community into the future? But there's still some work to do around this. I don't think that's enough. I think there's been openings that have appeared, but they're often very difficult to see. They often look kind of small scale or spread out. What we need to do is start having conversation about and developing a new economic narrative. By breaking through this kind of divide that happens around attacking capitalism, is it capitalism or not, what's the other, to actually getting back to basics and working with people in place to say, well, if the economy is just how we live, if it's just how we produce and exchange and work and how we consume things and what we do with waste, how can we do that differently here? How do we make sure everyone has enough to eat and has a home to live in? How do we think about the resources that we've got differently and who controls them? What does work look like? Could we be doing shorter working hours? Could we experiment with things like universal basic income? What about co-ops? What role do they play? And community financing? What does food justice look like? And what's the work we need to regenerate our landscapes? These are the questions that people are starting to explore, but I think we need to amplify these questions and put them out as questions as a starting point for conversation and co-creation and experimentation moving forward. So that's the first bit. How do we take advantage of the moment to open up conversations about the economy? But the second one, I think, is probably the scarier question for people. How do we bring people together around this? How do we hear such different voices and find a way forward to have a productive conversation? And how do we do it in a way that we actually have a chance to fundamentally shift the politics in this country so that the solutions, the many, many solutions that we already have, are not just remaining on the margins, but actually brought into the mainstream? Because we need to accelerate some and amplify these solutions in a way that we haven't seen ever before. if we're going to address the challenges around climate change. I mean, we need to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. That's a pretty big ask. We can do it, but we need people on board with that. And if we can't respond, we're facing even more division and conflict and uncertainty. So I want to share with you some ideas around how we do that and some principles to guide that discussion. And then I'll finish with an example of some recent work that we've done as to how we put that into practice. So in terms of principles, we've got to start with where people are at. And this requires place-based work. And when I'm saying this, I'm not just talking about community forums, I'm talking about bringing different sectors of the community together. So including decision makers across industry and government, environment sector groups, unions, social service organisations, and actually coming together going, what do we actually want to do? People in their own place are the ones who know their community better than anyone else. Second, we need to start with what people love and care about as a part of the starting point for the conversation rather than what we disagree on. Because people actually agree on the fundamentals much more than we ever think. People want to live in a place where they feel safe. They want a clean environment. They want a future for their kids. What that looks like in different places and to different people might differ, but the fundamentals are the same and a good place to start. The third is a bigger challenge, is around how we set up the spaces to make it safe for people to disagree, to actually have a diversity of views and to be curious about that and to explore why they see that the way that they see it. Can we see it from other views? Who else is not in the room that might see it differently to us? And all of that needs to be supported by facts. Facts are still important, and it's even more important face-to-face to bring in the experts to help people explore from their own situation what's relevant for them and to question what seems to be given reality. The next point, which I'm seeing happen in lots of places, which I think is really exciting but is done very quietly, is that people are learning democracy in new ways. So we've got groups like there's Democracy Network, there's Coalition of Everyone, and they're going out and teaching people how to run things like citizens' juries or assemblies. And they're popping up all over the country to allow people to have different kinds of discussions and make decisions about what they have control over. But by starting in that place, and sometimes over issues that don't look that important in the big scheme of things, it's actually it's expanding people's political capacity and confidence to hold our politicians to account and to have really interesting discussions about how we want government, what we want government for, how they should operate, and what they're responsible for. And in all of this, what we're doing is creating spaces for people to co-create the solutions and build a sense of agency and empowerment that I think most people don't feel that they have. For a long time, in Australia, at least for most people, the system kind of worked. And so they've never had to question it. They've never had to get political before. And I think we forget it's only been the last 5 years that we've had the huge climate strikes and movements that have really shaken people up and asked them to really question how the system works. Now's the time to start building that capacity and supporting people to figure things out. So I just want to finish with probably a practical example of what this has looked like for us over the last 12 months and how seemingly disparate kind of activities can actually come together to create political change. So as I said, we've worked all over Australia, but over the last 12 months, we really focused on Queensland, given the results of the last federal election and how Queensland voted. So we'd already been doing forums in a range of different places across Queensland. And so when Queensland voted was really the decisive factor in the federal election in voting in a Prime Minister that kissed a lump of coal in Parliament, I got contacted by the editor of The Guardian to say, hey, don't you do work in these communities? Do you know why these people voted the way they voted? Would you write an article on it? And to tell you the truth, I was a bit scared. But I was like, actually, I'm really angry at what I'm hearing people in places like Melbourne say, that they're just calling Queenslanders bogans. Because actually, I'm actually hearing that there's a whole lot of really serious issues in regional areas that nobody's talking about. So I understand why people are pretty angry and might have voted as a protest. So I wrote an article. Wasn't my choice of title, but it ended up being called why it's easy to dismiss Queensland as coal-addicted bogans, but it's more complex than that. So interestingly, the article kind of went international, and I got friends in Switzerland texting me about it or messaging me about it. But the other people who were watching were senior politicians in the Queensland Government. And I got invited to a forum that was being hosted by the Deputy Premier and the Shadow Federal Environment Minister to explore why Queensland was so divided. And the message was very clear from all 5 speakers that in regional Queensland, people wanted answers. They wanted to understand transition. They wanted to know what was going to happen after coal. And the fact that the government wasn't having that conversation just made people angrier and more scared. The Deputy Premier listened, but at the end of the forum said, "I'm sorry, Amanda, but the polling just doesn't say that people are ready to have that conversation yet." And the room erupted. There's 350 people in the room, and they were very noisy. And I said, "You have to listen to that. If we can't have a conversation about it, if you can't show that we've got ways forward, of course people, why would anyone trust you?" So I went up to her after the forum, and she was pretty angry. And I said to her, "Look, I know how to have the conversation. Can we just have a meeting? Because I think this is a really important time." So we had a meeting. She put me in touch with some departments, and 6 months later, we had Queensland Government funding to run a series of a roadshow, an energy transition roadshow across 6 regions in Queensland, including coal areas in central Queensland. And what was interesting about the forums was how there was a real shift from before the fires, where people were like, "Okay, we'll turn up, yes, transition, yep, what's involved exactly," to January and February, where people were saying, "Okay, yep, climate change. All right, we don't really understand it. We don't want to argue about it, but we need to get on with it. What are we going to do? We don't know what the future of coal is. So how do we diversify for no matter what happens, we're actually more resilient?" People would start off quite tentative at the beginning. We would have a series of presenters who were experts in their fields talking about trends and talking about economic opportunities. And then we would get people in groups, small groups, to talk about what was happening in their place that was already reducing and absorbing emissions across all different sectors. And at first people said, "Oh, nothing's happening here." But in the small groups, they started writing lists, and then they started writing more lists. And then it was hard to get them to stop. And the mood would shift, and people would sort of look up and go, "Oh, we've already got this. We've actually got something that we can work on." But the other interesting reaction were the government people in the room. We had a number of public servants in the room, and they listened. And a few of them came up to me, even called me after the forum and said, "Wow, we didn't want to have this conversation because we thought it was politically toxic. But now we actually can see that people want action. They want a transition plan. They want to understand it. This is going to make our job easier to fight for what we know needs to happen." Then COVID hit in March. And we had Butcher's Papers lists of economic stimulus ideas that aligned with the 2050 net zero emissions target. So I just sent emails to 5 different departments and said, "Hey, got this list of economic stimulus ideas you might be interested in at some point." And within 5 minutes, I had the Premier's department texting saying, "Don't have any time today, really want to talk to you, what have you got?" Also had the Energy Department do the same thing within half an hour. So we wrote a report called What Queensland Wants, which you can find on our website. And it was just a list of ideas that locals had come up with based on what was already happening across manufacturing, energy, land use, transport, waste, etc. We also did some media. And it was actually the Climate Media Centre who really encouraged me to get the report out there. And I thought, no one's going to be interested in this. But we got 62 media hits across regional Queensland, including around 20 News Limited papers. We also had radio interviews on commercial radio and TV as well. But the best thing were the people who were emailing me saying, "I read your article and it really resonates. I could hear my voice in that. Thank you." It's as simple as that. We've got to listen to people and report it back. The Queensland Government, some of the ideas in the report, when I had meetings with the departments, they were saying, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea, but no, that's not on our radar," ended up as election commitments. Don't know how much directly we had to do with that, but I did get some public servants comment that they did take the report seriously, because even though they had report after report submitted to them, this was based on what people in communities were saying that they wanted and were starting to take action on, and that was the difference. So we now do have a Labor government. They do have some good commitments around renewable energy, also some terrible commitments around coal mines, but they are starting to put things into action around the renewable energy zones. And I've been doing work with the government-owned energy corporation around how they can plan for transition over the long term. So change, it's not linear, but I think if we're really going to see the acceleration that we need, unfortunately, we do need to bring more people along with us. It's not as simple as influencing this or that minister anymore. We have so much at stake right now. If we don't get this right, I don't think we've seen anything in terms of the division and polarisation, because we're going to be hit with more challenges, whether that's climate change or more global financial instability into the future. So we've got a choice. Do we actually work with people and go, yep, we don't have all the answers, but we can figure this out. We have some solutions, and build their capacity to come up with their own solutions? Or do we just write them off? Because we've got so much to gain if we can engage people and bring them along with us. And we can actually create a better economy that looks after more people as well as the planet. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. This is exactly why we loved having Amanda with us at Engineers Without Borders, because we were a bunch of engineers who would, if left to our own devices, would just focus on the cool technical solutions that we assumed would be good for the communities and the people that we were trying to help. But having someone with Amanda's background and lens to refocus us on the people that we were trying to help, and to always ask those questions, how do we engage them? How do we involve them? How do we actually empower them to define what it is that they want for themselves and help them to achieve it for themselves, rather than us trying to work that out for them? And it's no surprise that that's also the answer for a lot of the troubles that we're facing now. So the questions are starting to stream in just as we speak. Sarah Thornton asks, what are some of the exciting developments you've seen? Are you inspired by any recent projects in Australia? Examples give us hope.
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to just go? Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. One I keep coming back to, because it's just super cool from a technological point of view as well as a people point of view, is the number of community-owned renewable energy projects that are springing up across the country. And probably the best story I love is when I did some work in Gloucester in New South Wales back in 2015, where the council was deciding whether to buy back the gas licences, and which would mean the end of coal seam gas in the region or not. And the town was split 50-50. So some women in the town decided to have a weekend where they talked about sustainable futures and, whatever the decision around gas was, how would they stimulate the local economy? And so we had a workshop on mapping out the strengths and the opportunities and what people were interested in. And there was also a workshop run by the Community Power Agency on community-owned renewables. And there were two blokes in the room who had been very public and vocal in their opposition to each other. They'd gone to school together, but they hadn't talked to each other for 5 years because one wanted gas and the other one didn't. So they had gone to both workshops. And on Sunday morning, when we asked, okay, did anyone have any ideas overnight? These two guys got up and everyone in the room went, what's going to happen? And they said, look, everyone knows that we're at war, but we're going to get over it because this community-owned renewable energy idea seems like a really good idea. Anyone wants to join, we're going to meet next week. So they're now on their third, in 5 years, they're now on their third project. They started by just putting solar panels on the neighbourhood centre. Then I can't remember the next building it was. And now they've actually got a large-scale solar farm that's under construction right now. And the profits are going back to the local community and supporting local developments. And that's happening all over the country, which I think is really cool.
Excellent. I've got another question here from Scott Bell. Amanda, can you please comment on the role of a citizens' assembly in distilling out the messages from the community?
Yeah, so it's being used in slightly different ways. Usually it's around where there's a contentious issue, is generally where I've seen it work best. So there's some division in the community and people just don't know what to do. And depending on how it's run, it can be quite an involved and long process around getting a number of different experts to speak from different angles on the issue. So the idea is you're actually presenting a case to the community so the community can figure things out. And then there's a process of decision making around that. So it can be used as sortition, where you select random people from the community who then make a decision based on that. And there's different ways of doing it. So it's just starting to happen en masse in Australia. I haven't run one myself, but I'd really like to participate in one. Most of the stuff I do, and this is kind of sad, I think, makes it easier, but it's also sad that actually people are crying out for meaningful consultation, that actually just getting people in the room at the moment and facilitating a discussion is already doing democracy for a lot of people. I think the next stage is to get a bit more creative with how we do that and use technology in different ways to help people explore and make decisions. So stay tuned if you want to know. I know that the Coalition of Everyone, and there's also Democracy Co. I think they're based in Adelaide. They run them, and they ran a successful one around the nuclear decision around the nuclear, whether South Australia would accept nuclear waste, which was really highly successful in terms of engaging people. And I think Melbourne is about to run one as well around sustainable futures. So yeah, Google it, and also Coalition of Everyone. So.
Fantastic. I've got a question from Christopher Cowles. What role do you think arts and culture practices can play in changing community attitudes? I guess we could broaden that question and just say, what role for arts and culture more generally? Yeah,
that's so important. I think Millie Rooney's listening in on this. This is something that Millie Rooney, who's the coordinator of Australia Remade, if you haven't heard about Australia Remade, please Google it, because that was also a nice piece of democracy and asking people what they want for the future and distilling that into a beautiful statement that you also can use to start community conversations with. But the role of play, the role of art and culture to get people out of their everyday reality and think from different angles is so important and so undervalued. And I must admit, I'm an academic sort of person, so I always feel a little bit uncomfortable when there's somebody who identifies as a clown in the room and that they're going to run sessions, and I start to get a bit nervous. But the role of, it's been beautiful when you see people get into their bodies and step out of their heads and start to experience things from different angles. I get people to draw a lot. I get people to role play. And it just helps people kind of embody. When you're in your body, sometimes you have a different reaction to things when you're in your head. So that embodiment practice, the creative practice to open up thinking into what if, to be inspired by other examples and beauty, and also the most powerful processes I've seen have actually been where people take themselves into nature. So they're doing the work on a farm or somewhere out of the normal reality as well, and can actually get grounded and actually connect with the earth. So I think we underestimate that. It's not just about the talk. In fact, if you just stay with the talk, it's too easy to just respond with what you normally respond with. We need to shake things up, and the arts and culture and dance and music and poetry and clowning, all of this is a really important way forward.
Very good. I've got a bunch of different questions here. We might be able to get onto them all, but we'll see how we go. So apologies if we don't get onto your question. I've got a question here from Bruce Jackson. How do we stop large resource companies buying government energy policy that suits their bottom line through political donations and whatnot?
Oh, that is the question. Yeah. If I had all the money in the world, the project I would take on would be to go around the country, or have people go around the country and train up independents. So people to actually represent their place and to shake up and just basically break up the party system. I would also ban political donations as a starting point. I think it would be a very quick way to cut through a lot of this, although there'll be other ways around it. But something needs to be done. And then the media influence is also a problem. But something needs to be done around this, because I'm seeing some really scary things happening. I was having some conversations with people in the Northern Territory this week There's a really cool climate justice alliance that's starting up there, that's unions, environment groups, Aboriginal organisations, social service organisations, really powerful coalition. But they're forming because what's being talked about up north, there's a whole lot of land that's being bought up by multinational companies that's really about water and capturing the water licenses and potentially commodifying water even further. There's plans for cotton, growing cotton in the Northern Territory. There is some really large-scale, very polluting industries that want to set up factories on processing plants in Darwin Harbour. Like it's 1950s style large-scale development that makes no sense actually economically or financially. They don't stack up. They don't stack up from a climate change perspective in terms of things like cotton being grown long term. And from a justice perspective, all these things require land grabbing. So there's a whole lot of land rights issues for Aboriginal people up north as well. And that's just one example, but those sorts of projects are being planned and laws are being changed to enable them to go through. And we're only going to see more of that unless we can get more organised. Yeah, so we definitely need to shake up the political system.
So I've got a few different questions here about different people's roles in bringing about this better future, bringing people together, reinventing how we do democracy. I was wondering, maybe we can try and roll them up together a bit. And I would ask, what do you think the key roles for different stakeholders are? And perhaps if you could tack on the end, if you're not in any of those positions of influence or power or whatever else, what would you suggest individuals can do to help?
So what do you mean by role of different stakeholders? Can you be more specific?
So politicians, someone's actually asked, Amanda, have you ever considered entering politics yourself? Could be a good idea if you're brave.
I'd cry too much in media conferences.
And
I think I'm more effective on the outside.
Yes, I was about to say, some people are more effective on the outside because it means you don't have to play that political game. Speaking of that political game, Nick Towell asked the question around our elected representatives tend to thrive on adversarial politics and often engage publicly to stoke community division. And there's a few questions about this kind of community division that's caused by politics. So how might we overcome or move beyond this?
Oh, okay, there's a lot in there. Going back to roles, I think there's a lot more space for imagining what the role of government is. Like, what does government mean? And it's really interesting because there's kind of this localization happening where local governments are actually the ones doing the most exciting work, particularly around climate action. It's really interesting that they're investing a lot in things like renewable energy projects and circular waste and all sorts of composting and different land use. So there's kind of this tension, and then COVID hit and there's been this centralisation again, which has undermined a lot of democratic processes. And there's been a lot done in the name of COVID to suspend even the systems we've got in place to allow for engagement. Which is a worry. I think the other major issue is government there's elected officials and then there are professionals. There are people in public service. And unfortunately, we've seen since the John Howard era, growing political influence of the ministers that has actually stopped public servants from being impartial without fear or favour. And I know this because I talk to a lot of public servants who are wringing their hands saying, well, we know what we need to do, but we just can't because the politics is just stopping it and the minister just comes over the top. So how do we get back to that? How do we get back to public servants being protected and having decent jobs and tenure so that they don't have to worry about losing their jobs every time there's an election, and that we've got that expertise within the system? So I think the role of government is probably that there's been a change, like about back around 2012, 2013, when we had Tony Abbott come in and Campbell Newman in Queensland, and all of the funding got ripped out of environment and community groups. It was interesting to see that people just were in denial for about 2 years. I was working with boards of environment organisations saying, oh no, we'll come back when the election changes. And then it was like, oh, it's not going back. And then there's about 18 months of just grieving the loss of a system that used to work. And it's only been the last couple of years that people are got angry and then are starting to get more active around engaging and challenging government around what its role is. And is it an innate? And so what we were hearing from industry and people on the ground in this last 18 months is we can't actually do anything more. Local governments, industry, the ones who are trying to do something are doing it all on their own. And there are pieces of the puzzle they can't. We need public investment in pieces of infrastructure. We need coordination. We need a longer view about things. We need the people who are going to bring people into the room and figure it out. And so people are really putting that pressure on government to say, you've got to step up. So the flip side of COVID is in some ways they've suspended democracy, but it's also demonstrated that government, when it wants to, can invest and can step in and can coordinate. So how do we hold them to account around climate change now? Because for years I've been saying, that's not our job. We can't do that. Sorry, I felt like I've lost the question there.
That's okay, you did well. There's a few questions around the role of activism. Someone's mentioned Extinction Rebellion specifically, but I guess just more generally, what is the role of activism in creating the new economy? And can I add a little question to that, which is, do you think that, because activism is often creates some division, is there another way that activists should consider going about their activism in order to bring people together rather than divide?
I think if there's only activism, it can be destructive. If there's only direct action, if there's only people pointing out the problems and there isn't the work, not just to identify the solutions, but to bring people along on that journey and manage the change, then it can be destructive on its own. But we need people right now. I mean, with the scale of the issues that we've got, we actually do need people drawing a line in the sand and making it really clear that enough is enough. We need people to make that case loud and clear that we need change. That is what creates the pressure for others to kind of reconsider the status quo. Without that pressure, things will continue on and we'll all stay in denial. So that is a piece of the puzzle. On the flip, so if you think about the climate movement, that is, Extinction Rebellion, it's the school strikers, it's Stop Adani, all of that's important. Then you've got groups that are coming up with the solutions, like your BZEs, your climate works, your universities, industry even, who are trying to figure out the way forward. The problem is we haven't had the bit in the middle to kind of move people once they're shocked into going, well, we need to change, to make it okay for them to explore what the solutions are and what it means for them in their place and how they can start to take action. Because in a way, we kind of assumed government would do that, but they're not. So the politics has stopped that from happening. So we need a lot more of that work on the ground to actually step people through, develop strategies and plans, work and identify the resources and expertise they need to take a step in the right direction. So yeah, I'm all for Extinction Rebellion. I'm all for people who are going to shake things up, that as long as it's non-violent. But because we need that, but we can't do that without all of the other pieces of the puzzle being as strong and as loud and as clear as well.
Of course, yes. We've got maybe about 10 minutes left. I've got a question here. How would you recommend people in Tasmania replicate your Queensland work?
There are people in Tasmania doing this work. I'm not going to be able to remember the name of the person I met. Michelle Luca. Anyway, there's some really interesting processes happening in the northwest corner that was brought about with around logging, and there was a big minerals processing plant that's likely to close, and actually starting to bring local government, community, industry, green groups together and unions to try and figure out what the future of the region is. So that is starting to happen there. It needs good facilitation, but I know that is happening. I know that people like Millie Rooney have been holding different kinds of conversations around the public good and what does that mean? That's not just limited to Tasmania, but there's people who are hosting these kinds of conversations. So you just need to look out and track them down.
And so I know that you've also been a board member for Beyond Zero Emissions, who've done some great work in fleshing out what the transition to a zero carbon and beyond economy would look like Australia-wide if it were out of focusing our energies on doing something like that for Tasmania, or more taking this approach of bringing people together and really listening and trying to overcome that community division. Which would you suggest, or is there a way of sort of doing them both together at the same time?
I think you need both. I mean, so the beautiful thing about BZE that I love technical people. That's why I was at Engineers Without Borders. You need people who know a lot about stuff. You need the nerds to go deep into the detail and do the modelling and figure that stuff out. That's often a different skill set to the people who are the people process people, to bring people together and be creative around how you have that conversation. But so we work with BZE. So often we'll have the community forum, we'll be invited into a community, and we'll be asking for someone from BZE to come and present into that discussion. So it's actually not mutually exclusive. You need both. In the Hunter, there's a group called the Hunter Renewable group that's kind of being spearheaded by a couple of different groups. And they're hosting that space and then bringing, again, BZE and other experts in to kind of go, what could the future for the Hunter look like? I guess I've been getting requests from Tasmania around logging and the impact on communities and the need to move away from native forests logging. So I think there is definitely a space to be having these conversations, and it's the same processes that are needed.
Okay, I think we've got time for another question before we wrap up, and there's a good one here. What advice do you give us urban dwellers who want to break out of the woke hippie stereotype and both care and be seen to care for Australians in fossil fuel communities? And do you think breaking down urban-rural polarisation as important right-wing politicians seem to use it to divide us?
Yeah, it's tricky. Well, after the federal election, there were a lot of green groups that all of a sudden felt a sense of guilt that they hadn't been actually connecting with regional communities. And I was at a meeting where they were like, great, we need our regional engagement strategy, and everyone was going to go out to the bush and save them. And I was like, the voice in the room ironically going, please don't. It can't come from you. This has actually got to come from, I go where I'm invited is one of my number one rules. And sometimes that I'm invited by the state government, so not necessarily someone locally, but I am invited into a conversation when people are ready to have that. And I think that's an important point. That's different if you're doing the direct action campaigning thing, you need to push in. But for this kind of work, there needs to be openness for you to actually engage. And there needs to be something practical that you're offering as well. Because can you imagine just somebody walking into your home and kind of going, I'm here, I want to heal our divide. Can I come in? It's like, well, who are you and why are you here and what am I getting out of this is kind of that reaction. So I think there's a lot of sensitivity in regional communities about outsiders coming in. I start with a lot of listening. Even before we run an event, we have a whole lot of one-on-one conversations with the leaders in the community saying, you know, how can we be of benefit here? How do you want this conversation to happen, and be guided by that rather than what necessarily we just want to achieve. And it's about coming together. I mean, we're very open and honest about where we're coming from but there's got to be that kind of agreement before the conversation can move ahead. But standing up for workers, I think probably is a good starting point around that they deserve, in fossil fuel communities, they deserve a future too. So some of the work the union's doing and getting behind that would be good.
On the workers and the union movement, sometimes there is some conflict between the labour movement and the environmental movement. How would you go about approaching that? Well,
the union movement, like the environment movement, is not a monolith. There are many different groups with very different agendas. There's some really great work that's being done to build coalitions between environment and union groups. So, for example, the Climate Action Network of Australia is hosting a series of conversations with the union movement around a shared agenda, and what does that actually look like, and actually having that conversation between the groups to make sense of that. You know, there's union groups that very much aligned with the climate agenda and willing to get on board, and there are others that aren't. So it's about relationship building again, and building those networks, and not just with between environment union groups, but also social service organisations and organisations focused on justice, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations. I think we can build a much broader coalition than that, but it takes time. It's all about, sounds so cliche, but it is about the relationships and the trust building, and then working out what do we have in common that we can come together around, and accept that there are some things that we're always going to disagree on as well. So it's to have that robustness, it's all about the relationships. So you can disagree, you can split apart and come back together.
I think, as you said earlier, inequality is an environmental issue. Polarisation is an environmental issue. And if we're really serious about trying to tackle these major environmental issues that we face today, then overcoming inequality and overcoming polarisation are absolutely critical to that. I think one of the key messages that I've got from the lecture. Thank you. And on that note, I'd like to thank Amanda Cahill for delivering the 27th Richard Jones Memorial Lecture today. I'm sure you'd all agree that that was a very thought-provoking lecture from Amanda. This evening's talk will be available soon as a video and podcast via the Island Ideas website that's now on your screens. The series continues with the upcoming online public lectures and forums also on your screen. So thank you for taking part in this event. Good evening. Thank you.